dawn of destiny. In the early morning hours of June 4th, 1942, the vast Pacific Ocean lay deceptively calm beneath a scattered blanket of clouds. The sun had not yet fully risen over the remote Midway atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand lost in the immensity of the world's largest ocean. For most of human history, this isolated outpost had known only the calls of seabirds and the endless rhythm of waves. But on this day, Midway would become the stage for one of the most consequential naval battles in human history, a clash that would fundamentally alter the course of World War II and reshape the balance of power in the Pacific for generations to come. The story of Midway cannot be told without understanding the context of fear, desperation, and determination that brought two mighty fleets to this remote battlefield. Just 6 months earlier, the world had watched in shock as Japanese forces executed a devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, crippling the American Pacific Fleet and bringing the United States into the global conflict. In the months that followed, Japan had swept across the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum, conquering territory from the Solomon Islands to the borders of India, from the Aleutians to the doorstep of Australia. The rising sun flag flew over an empire that now controlled more territory and resources than Imperial Japan had ever dreamed possible. For the American people still reeling from Pearl Harbor, the spring of 1942 was a time of profound anxiety. Newspaper headlines brought only bad news: the fall of the Philippines, the surrender of tens of thousands of Allied troops, the loss of vital territories rich in oil and rubber. The Japanese military seemed invincible, their carrier strike force an unstoppable weapon that had humiliated the Western powers. There were genuine fears that Hawaii itself might fall, that the West Coast could face invasion, that the war in the Pacific might already be lost before it had truly begun. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant commander of the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, understood that time was not on Japan's side. Despite the stunning victories of the previous months, he knew that America's industrial might, once fully mobilized, would eventually overwhelm Japan's more limited resources. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard, had traveled extensively in America, and he understood better than most Japanese leaders the true economic power of the United States. He had famously warned his superiors before Pearl Harbor that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but could promise nothing after that. Now, as spring turned to summer in 1942, those 6 months were nearly up. Yamamoto's strategic vision was bold and, in his view, necessary for Japan's survival. He needed to destroy what remained of the American carrier fleet before it could be reinforced by new construction. He needed to establish a defensive perimeter so vast that America would be forced to negotiate a peace that left Japan's conquests intact. And he needed to do this quickly, decisively, and with the same shocking force that had characterized the Pearl Harbor attack. The target he chose for this decisive battle was Midway Atoll, a small American outpost roughly halfway between Asia and North America. By threatening Midway, Yamamoto believed he could lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a trap where it could be destroyed once and for all. What Yamamoto did not know, what he could not have known, was that American cryptanalysts had accomplished one of the most remarkable intelligence coups of the war. Working in a basement at Pearl Harbor under the leadership of Commander Joseph Rochefort, a team of codebreakers had partially cracked the Japanese Navy's operational code, designated JN-25. Through painstaking work, brilliant intuition, and a touch of deception, these analysts had discovered not only that Japan was planning a major operation, but that the target was Midway itself. This intelligence breakthrough would prove to be every bit as important as the bravery of the pilots and sailors who would fight the battle. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, was a calculated risk-taker who had the courage to trust his intelligence officers. Upon learning of Yamamoto's plan, Nimitz made the fateful decision to commit everything he had to ambush the Japanese at Midway. It was an enormous gamble. If the intelligence was wrong, if it was a Japanese deception, then the American carriers would be caught out of position and potentially destroyed. But Nimitz believed in his codebreakers, and he believed that this might be America's only chance to stop the Japanese advance and seize the initiative in the Pacific War.
The forces that converged on Midway in late May and early June of 1942 represented the peak of naval aviation technology and the finest trained sailors and aviators that both nations could field. The scale of the Japanese operation was breathtaking in its ambition and complexity. Yamamoto assembled virtually the entire strength of the combined fleet for Operation MI, as the Midway attack was codenamed. The Japanese plan involved multiple task forces approaching from different directions, diversionary attacks on the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces north, and a massive invasion force prepared to seize Midway itself once American air power had been neutralized. At the heart of the Japanese striking force were 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were not just any carriers. They were the same vessels that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the elite of the Japanese carrier force, crewed by pilots who had trained together for years and had accumulated combat experience from Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, and the South Pacific. The Akagi was Admiral Chuichi Naguma's flagship, a powerful and fast carrier converted from a battlecruiser design. The Kaga was one of the largest carriers afloat, capable of carrying more aircraft than any other ship in the Japanese fleet. The Soryu and Hiryu were newer, faster designs, representing the state-of-the-art in carrier construction. Together, these 4 carriers could launch over 240 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes that had proven devastatingly effective in every engagement they had fought. Supporting the carriers was an impressive array of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. 2 fast battleships, Haruna and Kirishima, screened the carriers and provided anti-aircraft support. A squadron of heavy cruisers added their firepower and scouting capabilities, and dozens of destroyers formed a protective shield around the valuable carriers. Further beyond, in a separate force that Yamamoto personally commanded from the super battleship Yamato, were the main battle line, 7 battleships, including the most powerful warships ever built, ready to engage and destroy any American surface forces that might appear. The invasion force consisted of troop transports, carrying over 5,000 soldiers, supported by cruisers, destroyers, and escort carriers. The plan called for these troops to land on Midway after the initial airstrikes had neutralized the atoll's defenses. Japanese planners expected that the American fleet would rush to Midway's defense, only to be caught between the superior forces of the carrier's striking force and the overwhelming firepower of Yamamoto's battleships. It seemed like an almost foolproof plan, overwhelming force applied with the precision and skill that had characterized every Japanese operation thus far in the war. Against this armada, Admiral Nimitz could only muster 3 aircraft carriers, and one of those was damaged. The USS Enterprise and USS Hornet were sisters of the Yorktown class, modern fleet carriers that represented America's newest carrier designs. But it was the 3rd carrier, USS Yorktown, that told a story of American determination and industrial prowess. The Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month earlier. Japanese intelligence reported her as sunk. Navy estimates suggested she would need 3 months of repairs. But in an extraordinary feat of round-the-clock work, shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor patched her up enough to sail in just 72 hours. When Yorktown sortied for Midway, welders were still on board making repairs as the ship headed toward battle. The American carrier force was commanded by 2 very different admirals. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, aboard Yorktown, was the overall tactical commander. Fletcher was cautious and methodical, sometimes criticized for being too conservative, but he had survived the early disasters of the war and had fought the Japanese to a tactical draw at Coral Sea. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Enterprise and Hornet Task Force, was something of an unknown quantity. A cruiser admiral by background, Spruance had only recently taken command of carriers when Admiral William Halsey fell ill. But Spruance would prove to be one of the brilliant tactical minds in naval history, calm under pressure and blessed with an uncanny ability to make the right decision at critical moments. The American carriers were supported by a force of 8 cruisers and 14 destroyers, formidable ships, but significantly outnumbered by the Japanese. What the Americans lacked in numbers, they would have to make up for with intelligence, positioning, and sheer courage. Nimitz had positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, in a location that the Japanese did not expect American ships to be. When the Japanese attacked Midway, as intelligence predicted they would, the American carriers would already be in position to launch a counterattack against the Japanese fleet before it even knew they were there. On Midway itself, the defenders prepared for the onslaught they knew was coming. The The small atoll, barely 6 miles across at its widest point, was home to just over 2,000 military personnel, Marines, Navy personnel, and Army Air Force units. They had been reinforced with every aircraft that could be spared: Marine dive bombers and fighters, Navy patrol planes, Army B-17 bombers, and even a handful of torpedo bombers crewed by Marines who had never flown the aircraft in combat before. Many of these aircraft were obsolete and many of the pilots were inexperienced, but they represented every asset that could be brought to bear. The island's defenses had been strengthened with anti-aircraft guns, coastal artillery, and fortified positions. The Marines on Midway knew they were the bait in a trap, and they were determined to make the Japanese pay dearly for every foot of coral.
June 3rd. The curtain rises. The battle did not begin with a dramatic carrier clash, but with a series of preliminary moves that set the stage for the decisive action to come. On June 3rd, American patrol planes from Midway spotted elements of the Japanese invasion force several hundred miles to the west of the atoll. This was not the main carrier striking force, but the sighting confirmed that the Japanese operation was unfolding as intelligence had predicted. Army B-17 bombers based on Midway made a high-altitude bombing attack on the Japanese transports, dropping their bombs from 20,000 feet through clouds and claiming hits. In reality, the attack was ineffective. High-altitude bombing against maneuvering ships would prove notoriously inaccurate throughout the war. But it gave the Midway defenders their first taste of combat and alerted the Japanese that they had been detected. That night, 4 Navy PBY Catalina patrol planes made a daring torpedo attack on the Japanese invasion force under cover of darkness. These slow, vulnerable flying boats were designed for reconnaissance, not attack, but in the hands of brave crews, they pressed home their attack through anti-aircraft fire. One torpedo struck the tanker Akabona Maru, damaging but not sinking her. It was a minor success, but it further alerted the Japanese that Midway was on high alert and aware of the approaching threat. Aboard the Japanese carriers, now approaching from the northwest, the crews made final preparations for the attack planned for dawn. Aircraft were armed with bombs for striking the island's installations. Pilots attended final briefings. Mechanics made last-minute adjustments to engines and airframes. The mood was confident, almost casual. These were veterans of Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Ceylon. They had never been defeated in battle. They had no reason to believe that tomorrow would be any different from their previous victories. On the American carriers, now waiting northeast of Midway in their ambush position, the atmosphere was tenser. The crews knew they were outnumbered. They knew the Japanese were considered unbeatable. Many of the pilots were relatively inexperienced, having only weeks or months of training compared to the years of preparation that Japanese aviators received. The aircraft they flew were often inferior to their Japanese counterparts. American torpedo planes were slow and vulnerable, the fighters less maneuverable than the legendary Zero. But the Americans had advantages that would prove decisive. They had surprise, they had intelligence about enemy positions, and they had an unshakable determination to avenge Pearl Harbor and stop the Japanese advance. Admiral Spruance, the cool-headed cruiser admiral now commanding 2/3 of America's carrier strength, spent the evening reviewing his plans. He had positioned his task force to be close enough to strike the Japanese carriers after they attacked Midway, but far enough away to avoid detection by Japanese scout planes. It was a calculated gamble, based on estimates of Japanese search patterns and the predicted timing of their attack. If Spruance moved too close, he risked being spotted and losing the element of surprise. If he stayed too far away, he might not be able to launch his strike in time before the Japanese recovered their Midway attack planes and were ready to strike back. The decisions made on this night would determine the fate of the battle and perhaps the entire Pacific War.
The Codebreakers: Intelligence's Decisive Role. The story of how American intelligence discovered Japan's intentions is itself a fascinating tale of brilliant minds working under pressure with incomplete information. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had been working on Japanese naval codes since before the war. The work was painstaking and frustrating. Imagine trying to solve a crossword puzzle where most of the clues are missing, the language is foreign, and getting a single answer wrong could cost thousands of lives. The Japanese JN25 code was a complex system that changed regularly. And even with their best efforts, American cryptanalysts could read only a fraction of intercepted messages, often with significant gaps and ambiguities. In early May 1942, the codebreakers began intercepting increasing volumes of Japanese radio traffic that referenced an upcoming operation. The target was referred to only as AF in the encrypted messages. Through careful analysis of message patterns, traffic volumes, and partial decrypts, Rochefort became convinced that AF was Midway and that the Japanese were planning a major attack. But convincing others, particularly some intelligence officers in Washington who disagreed with his assessment, required proof. What followed was an elegant deception. Rochefort suggested that Midway send an uncoded radio message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. Sure enough, within days, Japanese radio traffic mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The proof was conclusive. AF was Midway. This confirmation allowed Nimitz to plan with confidence, positioning his carriers based on predicted Japanese movements and timing. The intelligence coup extended beyond just identifying the target. Rochefort's team was able to provide Nimitz with information about the composition of Japanese forces, their approach routes, and even the approximate timing of the attack. This intelligence advantage cannot be overstated. Yamamoto's plan depended on surprise and overwhelming the Americans with superior numbers. But because Nimitz knew the Japanese were coming, he could position his inferior forces for maximum effect. Because he knew the timing, he could ensure his carriers were fueled, armed, and ready at the critical moment. And because he knew the enemy's order of battle, he could make informed decisions about when and how to commit his limited forces. In a very real sense, the Battle of Midway began not with the first bombs falling on June 4th, but weeks earlier in the basement code-breaking facility at Pearl Harbor. The importance of intelligence work in modern warfare would be demonstrated repeatedly throughout World War II, from the breaking of the German Enigma code to the deception operations around D-Day. But perhaps nowhere was the impact more immediate and decisive at Midway, where the work of a few dozen cryptanalysts and intelligence officers helped balance the scales against a numerically superior enemy force. These men and women, for there were female cryptanalysts involved in the effort, were fighting the battle with their minds, working exhausting shifts to pull meaning from fragmentary intercepts and coded messages. They would never receive public recognition during the war, as their work remained classified for decades. But their contribution to the American victory at Midway was absolutely fundamental. June 4th, morning, the Japanese strike Midway. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, under a sky beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn, Admiral Nagumo gave the order to launch the first wave against Midway. From the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 108 aircraft roared into the sky, 36 dive bombers, 36 torpedo planes configured as level bombers, and 36 Zero fighters for escort and defense suppression. The launch was executed with the precision of a drill, each plane following the next at precise intervals, forming up in the growing light before turning toward their target over 200 miles away. It was a powerful strike force, more than enough to overwhelm Midway's defenses, or so Japanese planners believed. What Nagumo did not know was that American radar on Midway had detected the incoming strike at a range of 93 miles. It was one of the early warning radars that had been rushed to Pacific outposts after the disaster at Pearl Harbor, and it was about to prove its worth. At 5:53 a.m., air raid sirens wailed across the small atoll. Every aircraft on Midway that could fly was immediately scrambled, not to engage the Japanese in a dogfight they couldn't win, but to get airborne and avoid destruction on the ground. Marine fighters climbed to altitude to intercept the attackers, while the bombers and torpedo planes headed out to search for and attack the Japanese carriers. At 6:16 a.m., the Marine fighters made contact with the incoming Japanese formation. The Marines were flying a mix of aircraft, some obsolete F-2A Buffalo fighters that were already considered death traps, and some newer F-4F Wildcats that were more capable but still outclassed by the Zero. What followed was a brief and brutal air battle. The Marine pilots fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and outperformed. Within minutes, 15 of the 27 Marine fighters were shot down. The survivors, many wounded and their aircraft shot full of holes, managed to land at Midway or ditch offshore. They had barely slowed the Japanese attack. At 6:30 a.m., the Japanese strike force reached Midway and began their attack. For the defenders on the ground, it was a terrifying experience. The sky filled with diving planes, the earth shaking with explosions, buildings erupting in flames, the chatter of machine guns, and the heavier thud of anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese pilots, masters of their craft, pressed their attacks with precision despite heavy anti-aircraft fire from the ground. Hangars, fuel tanks, and the powerhouse were hit. The Marine command post was destroyed, killing several men. But the raid was not the complete success the Japanese had hoped for. Midway's runways, though damaged, remained operational. The anti-aircraft defenses, strengthened in previous weeks, shot down several Japanese aircraft and damaged many others. And perhaps most importantly, by getting their aircraft off the ground before the attack arrived, the defenders had denied the Japanese the crushing blow they had inflicted at Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the strike, radioed back to Nagumo at 7 a.m. with a fateful message. There is need for a second attack wave. This message would prove to be one of the critical turning points of the battle. Nagumo faced a dilemma. He had held back a second wave of aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, weapons intended for attacking ships rather than land targets. Standard Japanese doctrine in such situations called for being prepared to strike enemy ships if they appeared. But Midway's defenses remained active, and Tomonaga, a trusted and experienced officer, was calling for another strike. Nagumo made his decision. He would rearm the second wave with land attack bombs and prepare for a second strike on Midway. What Nagumo did not know yet was that American carriers were already in the area and preparing to attack his ships. Japanese search planes had been launched at dawn, but the search pattern had gaps in it. One scout plane from the cruiser Tone had launched late due to catapult problems, creating a hole in the search pattern in precisely the direction where the American carriers were waiting. It was one of the early warning radars that had been rushed to Pacific outposts after the disaster at Pearl Harbor, and it was about to prove its worth.
The American strike group's launch. While Japanese planes were striking Midway, Admiral Spruance faced his own critical decisions. His task force had been spotted by a Japanese scout plane at 5:34 a.m., though he didn't know this yet. What he did know from radio intercepts and patrol plane reports was the approximate position of the Japanese carriers. Spruance now had to decide when to launch his strike. If he launched immediately, his planes would have maximum range to reach the enemy, but the Japanese carriers might still be recovering their Midway attack planes and be most vulnerable. If he waited, he would close the range and give his planes more fuel margin, but the Japanese might have more fighters in the air to defend against his attack. Spruance made the aggressive choice: launch immediately and strike while the Japanese were recovering their planes from the Midway attack. It was a calculated risk that would leave his torpedo bombers, in particular, at the extreme limit of their range, with little margin for error. At 7 a.m., Enterprise began launching aircraft. Hornet followed shortly after. In total, the two carriers put up 117 aircraft: dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighter escorts. It was everything they had, an all-in commitment to this single strike. Meanwhile, from Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher held back temporarily to wait for more definite information on Japanese positions. At 8:30 a.m., satisfied that he had good coordinates for the enemy carriers, Fletcher launched a smaller but still substantial strike group from Yorktown: 17 dive bombers, 12 torpedo bombers, and 6 fighters. Now, 3 American strike groups were winging toward the Japanese fleet, though they would arrive at different times and by different routes due to navigational errors and the different launch times. The American pilots flying toward the Japanese fleet were under no illusions about the dangers they faced. Many were going into combat for the first time. Their aircraft were not as advanced as the Japanese planes they would face. The TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were slow, lumbering planes that had to fly straight and level for the final approach to drop their torpedoes, making them easy targets. The dive bombers were better. The SBD Dauntless was a rugged and accurate aircraft, but they would have to penetrate a screen of defending fighters and anti-aircraft fire to deliver their bombs. And the F-4F Wildcat fighters, while tough and well-armed, were outmatched in maneuverability by the Zero. But these American pilots had something more powerful than superior aircraft. They had a cause they believed in utterly, and they had the knowledge that they were striking back against an enemy that had dealt America its greatest military humiliation at Pearl Harbor. Many wrote letters to loved ones before the battle, understanding they might not return. They checked their aircraft, tested their guns, and tried to suppress the natural fear that comes with flying into combat. Then they climbed into their cockpits and followed their leaders toward an uncertain fate.
The Japanese Dilemma, Nagumo's Fatal Hesitation. At 7:15 a.m., as Nagumo was processing Lieutenant Tomonaga's message requesting a second strike on Midway, he received another piece of information that changed everything. The scout plane from the cruiser Tone, the one that had launched late, radioed a sighting report. 10 ships, apparently enemy, sighting bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. American ships were in the area, contrary to all intelligence estimates. The sighting was vague, no mention of carriers, but it was enough to make Nagumo pause. Were these carriers, or just cruisers and destroyers? If carriers, they represented a mortal threat. If merely screening forces, then the second strike on Midway should proceed. Nagumo ordered the scout plane to ascertain the composition of the enemy force, but valuable minutes were ticking away. At 7:45 a.m., he received another report. The enemy force included at least one carrier. Now the situation was crystal clear. There were American carriers within striking range, and they might attack at any moment. Nagumo immediately ordered the aircraft that he had begun rearming for the Midway strike to be rearmed again with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for ship attack. It was the right decision, but it came at a terrible cost in time. On the carrier hangar decks, organized chaos erupted. Ordnance crews had to remove the land attack bombs they had just loaded and bring up torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs from the magazines. This was a time-consuming and dangerous process, even under ideal conditions. Making it more complicated was the fact that the first strike wave for Midway was now returning and needed to be recovered immediately. The planes were low on fuel and many were damaged. Japanese doctrine called for clearing the flight deck to recover returning aircraft, which meant that any armed aircraft on deck had to be struck below to the hangar deck where they joined the chaos of rearming operations. The scene on the Japanese carriers between 7:30 and 9 a.m. was one of frantic but professional activity. Pilots from the Midway strike landed, their aircraft immediately struck below on the elevator platforms. Ordnance crews wrestled with heavy torpedoes and bombs. Fuel crews topped off aircraft that would be going out with the next strike. Mechanics checked over aircraft and made hasty repairs. It was organized, it was efficient, and under any other circumstances it would have been fast enough. But this morning, every minute counted, and the Americans were coming. At 8:20 a.m., Nagumo received confirmation that American carrier aircraft had been sighted approaching his fleet. The admiral now faced an agonizing choice: launch his strike aircraft immediately with whatever ordnance they currently had, even though many were still configured for land attack, or wait until all aircraft were properly armed with ship-killing weapons. Nagumo chose to wait. It was a defensible decision. He wanted his first strike to be devastating and decisive, but it meant that when the American attack arrived, his flight decks would be cluttered with fully fueled and armed aircraft ready to launch but fatally vulnerable. By 9 a.m., the Japanese carriers had recovered all their Midway strike aircraft and were nearly ready to launch a massive counterstrike against the American carriers. On the flight decks of all 4 carriers, aircraft were spotted for launch: fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, all armed and fueled. Anti-aircraft guns were fully manned. Everything seemed ready.
Just a few more minutes to launch and the Japanese counterstrike would be on its way. But time had run out.
The first American attack wave to reach the Japanese fleet was Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. VT-8 had become separated from the rest of the Hornet's air group due to navigational differences and arrived at the Japanese fleet alone at approximately 9:20 a.m. Waldron led 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, slow and obsolete aircraft that would have to fly low and straight through a storm of anti-aircraft fire and defending fighters to drop their torpedoes. They had no fighter escort. The Wildcats that were supposed to protect them had gone a different direction with the dive bombers. Waldron saw the Japanese fleet spread out below him, 4 carriers in a rough box formation, surrounded by a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. It was a magnificent and terrible sight. He knew what he had to do. Before the battle, Waldron had told his men, "If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." Now he led his squadron down to attack altitude, just a few hundred feet above the ocean, and turned toward the carriers. What followed was one of the most heroic and tragic actions in naval aviation history. As VT-8 began its attack run, Japanese Zero fighters from the Combat Air Patrol dove on them like hawks on pigeons. The Devastators, slow and unmaneuverable when carrying torpedoes, were easy prey. One by one, they were shot down. Waldron's plane was among the first to fall, burning as it hit the water. The surviving aircraft pressed on, their gunners firing back at the swarms of Zeros, the pilots holding course despite the fire all around them. The carriers turned hard, their anti-aircraft guns adding to the barrage. Torpedo wakes in the water were evaded by the nimble Japanese ships. Within 10 minutes, it was over. All 15 aircraft of VT-8 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. Of the 30 men who had flown with the squadron that morning, only one survived. Ensign George Gay, whose plane was the last to be shot down. Gay survived the crash and found himself floating in the water in the midst of the Japanese fleet, hiding under his seat cushion as the battle raged around him. He would be the sole witness to everything that followed, a remarkable story of survival and a testament to the courage of his squadron mates who had died around him. The sacrifice of VT-8 was not in vain, though they could not know it. Their attack had drawn the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level. The Zeros were now at low altitude, focused on finishing off the American torpedo bombers. The anti-aircraft gunners on the Japanese ships were tracking low-flying targets. Everyone's attention was focused down, on the surface of the ocean, where the torpedo attack had come from. No one was looking up. Shortly after VT-8 was annihilated, the torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived and pressed home their own attacks with the same courage and the same result. VT-6 from Enterprise lost 10 of 14 aircraft. VT-3 from Yorktown lost 10 of 12. The waters around the Japanese fleet were littered with debris and fuel slicks, marking where the American planes had fallen. Still, not a single torpedo had found its mark. The Japanese carriers steamed on, apparently invincible, their crews preparing to launch the counterstrike that would crush the American fleet.
5 minutes that changed the world. At 10:22 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading the dive bomber squadrons from USS Enterprise, spotted the Japanese fleet. McCluskey had been searching for over 2 hours, his fuel running dangerously low, beginning to wonder if he would have to turn back without finding the enemy. Then he noticed a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast and correctly guessed it was hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. Following the destroyer's wake, McCluskey found what he was looking for: 4 Japanese carriers, their decks packed with armed and fueled aircraft preparing to launch. The scene below him was a target so perfect it seemed unreal. The Japanese carriers were in the midst of launching operations, their decks crowded with aircraft. The Combat Air Patrol fighters were at sea level, still climbing back to altitude after dealing with the torpedo attacks. The anti-aircraft gunners were reloading and reorienting. For a brief moment, a window of perhaps 5 minutes, the Japanese fleet was vulnerable. McCluskey made his decision instantly. He would lead his squadron against the nearest carrier while the second squadron attacked another target. There was no time for elaborate coordination, no time for anything but immediate action. McCluskey pushed over into his dive from 14,500 feet, the rest of his squadron following. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers plummeted toward their targets at angles approaching vertical, their airspeed building toward 250 knots, their dive brakes deployed to control the acceleration. In the rear seat of each aircraft, the radio operator gunner braced himself against the brutal G-forces and prayed. In the front seat, the pilot fought to keep the target in his sights, making constant tiny adjustments, watching the altitude unwind, waiting for the right moment to release. All the training, all the practice came down to these few seconds of precision flying while anti-aircraft fire reached up toward them and the target grew larger in the bomb sight. At the same moment, by sheer chance, the dive bomber squadron from Yorktown arrived at the scene from a different direction. They had become separated from their torpedo squadron and fighters and had also spent an anxious time searching for the Japanese fleet. Now, they too spotted the carriers and immediately began their attack dives. Two American dive bomber squadrons, arriving by different routes and completely uncoordinated, were attacking simultaneously from different angles. It was the kind of perfect tactical situation that no amount of planning could have achieved, pure chance combining with the courage and determination of the American air crews. At 10:24 a.m., the first American bomb struck Akagi, Admiral Naguno's flagship. The initial hit was relatively small, but it struck directly among the massed aircraft on the flight deck. Fueled and armed planes erupted in flames, secondary explosions rippled across the deck as ordnance detonated. Within seconds, Akagi transformed from a proud warship into a floating inferno. Naguno and his staff would eventually be forced to abandon ship, transferring to a cruiser to continue directing the battle. But Akagi was effectively finished. She would burn out of control for the rest of the day before being scuttled. Seconds later, Kaga was hit by at least 4 bombs, possibly more. The massive carrier, the largest in the Japanese fleet, suffered devastating damage. Fire spread uncontrollably through the ship. The hangar deck, filled with aircraft being serviced and rearmed, became a death trap as fires and explosions swept through the enclosed space. Within 20 minutes, Kaga's captain would give the order to abandon ship. The carrier would finally sink that evening, taking over 800 men with her. Soryu, the third carrier, was hit by 3 bombs in rapid succession. Like her sister ship, Soryu had aircraft on deck armed and fueled for the counterstrike. The bombs touched off catastrophic fires that proved impossible to control. The carrier's CEO, Captain Yanagimoto, would go down with his ship, last seen standing on the bridge singing the Japanese national anthem as Soryu slipped beneath the waves later that afternoon, killing over 700 of her crew.